Hey kids, I am back with chapter 4 of our book, Escape from Alcatraz. This chapter is called Tying Up Details. It says, after West told Morris about the open shaft, and after Morris told West that he could chip away at the concrete around his cell vent, things began to move quickly. The Anglin brothers were brought into the plan. Like West and Morris, they had cells next to each other on cell block B. One from each pair could dig at his vent, while the other acted as a lookout. Behind cell block B was the utility corridor they wanted to reach. Many questions remained. The cells across the aisle from them in cell block A were empty, so no other prisoners could look directly in at them. But what about the prisoners on the opposite side of the utility corridor? Surely they would hear all the noise. Alan West approached a prisoner named Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was the leader of the African-American inmates, all of whom were housed in the cells behind them. He had been a powerful gangster before being locked up, and he was just as powerful inside Alcatraz. Bumpy assured West that nobody on his cell block would say a word. West was also able to produce 2-star drills that were hidden in the prison. Years ago, a shipment of woodworking tools had arrived at the shop in Alcatraz. Among them were the 2-star drills, drill bits with cutting edges in a star pattern that were especially made for cutting into concrete. They didn't require a machine. Rather, they were meant to be hammered in by hand. The star drills were accidentally included in the shipment. An inmate quickly pocketed them and hid them away. West knew where they were, and he retrieved them. The star drills made the work of digging much easier. Some investigators believe that there were other stolen tools used for digging as well. According to Clarence Carnes, Alan West approached him next. Like West, Carnes was a veteran of the Rock. He'd been there since 1945, when he was only 18 years old. Carnes had been convicted of kidnapping, murder, and, of course, escaping from a county jail. He knew even more of Alcatraz's secrets than West did. Even better, he worked in the library. That meant he had access to hiding places for banned items, as well as the freedom to move around the cell house delivering magazines and books. Carnes claimed West asked him if he wanted to join their plan. After carefully thinking it over, Carnes agreed, but he warned West that there was a lot of heat on him. Carnes meant that the guards and officers tended to watch him very carefully. That was because he'd taken part in an Alcatraz escape attempt some years earlier, one that had ended violently. Known as the Battle of Alcatraz, 6 prisoners had strong-armed some guards and taken their guns and keys. But they didn't get the key to the recreation yard, which was how they'd planned to get out. It was clear at that point that the plan was not going to work, and 3 of the prisoners, including Carnes, went back to their cells to wait for officers to end the threat. But the others decided to fight to the death, preferring that to a lifetime in prison. They shot 2 officers to death and injured at least 14 others. Eventually, the U.S. Marines and the U.S. Coast Guard were called in, and the riot was ended. The 3 prisoners who were still fighting were killed. 2 of those who went back to their cells were sentenced to death. Carnes, who was only 19 at the time, had an extra 99 years added onto his sentence. West talked it over with Morris and the Anglins. Eventually they agreed it was too risky to invite Carnes into their plan. West had already risked a lot just by being seen talking to Carnes so many times over a few days. He broke the news to Carnes. He was out. But according to Carnes, even being invited, even talking about the escape, was something to savor. He was heartbroken to be cut out, but he understood. He agreed to help his friends by providing information they needed. He worked with his connections in the library to hide and transport tools and other things for them. Like information and hiding places, something else was hard to come by on the Rock, and that was privacy. But in 1961, the mess hall had been changed in a way that might have seemed unimportant at the time. The long tables that had set 10 men to a table were replaced with smaller square tables. The new tables sat only 4 men. And with this new setup, Morris, West, J.W., and Clarence Anglin could talk among themselves without being overheard. At each meal, they could quietly discuss their plan. They could update each other on how the digging was coming along. They could bring up challenges and brainstorm solutions. It was at one of these meal discussions that Morris told the men to subscribe to lots of magazines. He told them to cut out pages that had ads on both sides and cut them close to the binding so nobody would notice a page was missing. The men would use glue to layer the sheets to make cardboard, and they would also need paint to make the cardboard look like the grill vents. The plan was to remove the real grill vents and stash them in the utility corridor behind the cells. Then they would replace them with the cardboard fakes. They also discussed their digging progress at meals. The star drills made holes, but it would take ages to drill through enough holes to pull out the grill. The answer was right there in the mess hall. The men stole spoons, bent off the bowls, and filed the ends sharp. With several holes drilled into one side of the vent, the men then hammered 3 spoon wedges into the concrete using the heel of a shoe. The wedges loosened, and a long line of concrete that they pried out. That made progress much quicker. Many of the men in Alcatraz owned musical instruments. They were allowed to play them in their cells between dinner and lights out. West, Morris, and the Anglins took advantage of this time to dig while the instruments provided camouflage for the noise. West had an accordion, which had another advantage besides the noise. It came in a bag case that he stored in front of his grill. Anyone passing by would see only a small part of the grill. He carefully covered the area where he was digging. Morris liked this idea, and he ordered an accordion through the purchasing officer at the prison. At night, the men dug. Morris laid down his heavy coat as a drop cloth to catch the dust and chunks that fell from his digging. That way, no evidence would be left on the floor, and any bigger pieces that fell wouldn't make a noise so they hit the concrete floor. Sometimes he dug for so long his legs were cramped and he had to change position or stand up to stretch. When he was finished for the night, he carefully gathered up the dust and rubble from his coat and put it in his pockets to discreetly drop in the recreation yard the next day. He was cautious only to dig so much that he could transport the waste without making a noticeable bulge in his pockets. He brushed any remaining dust off the coat into his sink and washed it down. While West and Morris scraped away, the others kept lookout. The lookout made an agreed-upon sound when the guard started heading their way. And the one digging would stop, slide the accordion case into place, and jump into bed. The Anglin brothers had a different setup. They ran a thin string from the cell of the lookout to the light switch in the cell of the digger. When the guard came, the lookout yanked the string and turned off his brother's light. That was the digger's signal to dash into bed. One night while West was digging, he made a clumsy mistake. He had his tools out on his bed when the guard was walking past. The only thing he could do was lean over the bundle to conceal them and hope the guard didn't wonder what he was doing. Luckily, the guard didn't pay any attention and kept on going. But then, as West got up, he dropped his star drill on the ground. Everyone heard it clang. He froze and waited for the guard to turn around. In the cell next door, Morris held his breath, but nothing happened. The guard paused for a few seconds, listened, and then walked on. Why hadn't he come back to investigate the sound? It made no sense. Clearly someone had something he should not have, but the guard ignored it. West thought maybe the guard was up to no good himself. Perhaps he was sneaking something in that he shouldn't have. Sometimes guards could be bribed to carry messages or other things for prisoners. If that was the case with this particular guard, he would not want to make a discovery that would require other guards coming in. Or maybe he thought it was West's razor dropping to the ground. Razors did make a similar sound. Whatever the reason, the scare passed. Not so coincidentally, the men all decided to take up painting as a hobby. They ordered paints, brushes, and canvases, and they painted portraits in their cells. The guards sometimes stopped by to look at the paintings. Before long, it seemed normal to see the men painting, and nobody thought it was unusual for them to order paints, even skin-colored paints. After all, the men were painting portraits. But painting portraits was just a cover story. The real reason the men began to paint was so they could paint things that would help in their escape. First, they painted the fake cardboard grills in Alcatraz's signature mint green color to match the real ones. They also began to put together the dummy heads that they would soon need. They made plaster out of paper from magazines, concrete dust, soap, and any other materials they may have found laying around. Then they painted the heads to look like themselves. Clarence Anglin had a job in the barber shop. He had no experience cutting hair, but like most jobs on the Rock, you didn't need experience. So what if you gave someone a less than perfect haircut? The advantage for Clarence was that he was able to pocket real human hair at the end of his shift. At night in his cell, he tied the hair into tiny bundles and glued the bundles onto the dummy heads. Just like the other details of the men's plan, each tiny bundle of hair required careful attention to detail. That's the end of that chapter. There's a picture here. It says view of the dugout vent in one of the escapees' cells. So you can kind of see where they were digging around the vent. If I hold that up close to the camera, the vent is like right there by the corner of the bed. So that's what the inside of a cell looks like at Alcatraz. Okay, and so that's it for now. I'll see you when I'm back with chapter 5. Take care. Miss you guys.